So if you have a Bible, why don't you open it up to John 15. When you get there, why don't you stand, and we're going to read together from God's word, and I'm going to ask my wife, who is also a mother, and then one of her children to come and read our passage. So John 15.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear the fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have not spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit itself unless it abides in the fruit, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you cannot do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out the branch and he is withered, and they gather me and throw me into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask us what you desire, and it shall be done for you. But this my Father is glorified, that you may bear much fruit, and so you will be my disciples.
As the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name he may give you. These things I command you, that you love one another.
Thank you. You can grab a seat. I was thinking this week, I remember when Lindsay and I got married, the man who officiated our wedding said something rather memorable for me. And for most of us, when we get married, kind of everything is a blur that day. Maybe I'm only speaking on behalf of the men, but it just kind of all runs together. And I realize I officiate a lot of weddings, and when I do, I'm speaking to the couple right in front of me, but I'm assuming they're not hearing a word that I'm saying. I'm really wanting to then speak to them, but have it be heard by their friends and hopefully encourage or impact them. Because I know you're just kind of caught up in the moment. And that was true for me, but I remember the pastor saying something that kind of snapped me back into reality and made me present again to what he was actually saying. He made the comment that marriage is one of the most abiding of relationships. And I remember I turned and looked at him because I thought, what in the world does that even mean? That marriage is an abiding relationship. You see, our passage brings that concept of abiding to the forefront. And for most of us, maybe we've grown up hearing it, but it's such a churchy term that I think it's so wrapped up in mystique. It's almost enigmatic, like shrouded in mystery, that we don't even understand what Jesus is asking of us, that we're asked to abide in him, or that marriage is an abiding relationship. I don't even think that the man who said it even knew what he was saying. It just sounded good, and so he said it. But today what we do is we wrap up the end of our series looking at Jesus in his own words. We've been looking at these 7 statements that Jesus makes in John's gospel, these autobiographical statements that he makes that allows him to introduce himself to us clearly, removing any guesswork about who he is and what he came to do. And what he says here, in this final of the 7 I am statements, he says, I am the true vine. You find it there in John chapter 15, verse 1. And I hope you've enjoyed our little series together through these statements, as I have definitely enjoyed studying them and listening as Clay's taught a couple of them, but then even being able to teach them, because I really do believe that knowing the great I am really does change. It transforms who I am. And I'll tell you, it even settles my heart to hear with fresh ears all that God says that he is and promises to do in each of our lives. It's so good for us, because each of these 7 statements are ways that God will describe to us who he is and what he does and how he feels about us. But this final one, it almost takes a slightly different tone to it, because he really is communicating here not just something about himself, but he's communicating something about us, really about how our lives are changed and transformed. He's communicating here by calling himself the vine, the true vine. He's communicating how he works in your life. So if you're a person who's here today who's interested in growth and change to take place in your life, then don't miss what Jesus says is possible here. Because he really says that there's only one possibility to true transformation in someone's life. For a selfish person to somehow learn to think and live for other people, for a fearful person to turn into a person of courage and peace, or maybe even a controlling person to turn into a person of gentleness and kindness. Jesus is telling us the answer to that question of how does that kind of life transformation actually happen? Jesus responds by saying, it's me. It's going to happen through me because I am the vine, and the only way for real, lasting, permanent change is going to take place as you are connected to me. And as you're connected to me, you'll experience my life and my power and my spirit coursing through your veins like life that passes through the vine and into its branches. You see, the statement Jesus makes here that we consider together today is about us experiencing life and joy and transformation because of our connection to him. Again, Jesus' statement is, I am the true vine. You should know for context that this statement is found smack dab in the middle of something that long throughout church history has been referred to as Jesus' upper room discourse. You see, the other gospels, they will emphasize the meal and the ritual that Jesus will share around the table there in the upper room with his disciples. But John, however, he emphasizes in chapters 13 through 17, he emphasizes something completely different. He emphasizes the final conversation and teaching that was shared around the table at the Last Supper. And this portion that we've reached in the discussion where Jesus begins to talk about the vine and branches seems to take place after the meal has concluded, and once the disciples have arisen from the table and Judas has departed, and soon Jesus and his disciples will make their way towards the garden called Gethsemane, where Judas and a band of soldiers will come to arrest him. But today what we consider is the conversation that happens just before that moment. It's where Jesus again, he says, I am the true vine. And what I want you to look with me at is four different aspects to this, and the first is this. I want you to consider with me what Jesus says he is, but then a second thing, what Jesus says you are, but a third thing, what he says the Father does, and then the final and really most important thing is what Jesus says that you must do. So look with me, let's begin by talking about first and foremost what Jesus says he is. Because you'll find in John chapter 15, verse 5, he says, I'm the vine, but he begins the section in chapter 15, verse 1 by saying, I am the true vine. And I'll forewarn you, we're going to probably spend a couple more minutes in this section than the rest of it, because I think it helps to give some context to this discussion that Jesus is having. Because think about it, for Jesus to call himself the true vine is to contrast himself with someone or something else. Much like he did when he called himself not just a shepherd, but you remember he previously called himself the good shepherd. He wasn't just claiming to be a shepherd who watches over sheep. No, he's contrasting himself with other shepherds, saying that they might be bad and broken, but that I am the good shepherd. And here, his claim is not just that he is a vine, he is contrasting himself with another vine that was rebellious and failed to produce the fruit that it was intended to, when he here says that I am the true vine. So our question is, what's supposed to come to mind, or maybe the better question is, what would have come to mind for the first century audience, the first century disciples who lived in a Jewish context and culture when Jesus makes this statement that I am not just a vine, but I am the true vine. Jesus knows that soon he's going to be rejected by his people and that a cross lays before him. And I believe that Jesus also knows that rejection by the religious leaders and excommunication and great suffering lays before his disciples as well. So as Jesus addresses his disciples in this moment, really his final address to them, who will soon find themselves rejected and excommunicated like the former blind man we've discussed in these last few weeks, where they too will be not just removed from the flock, but they will be severed from the vine by the religious leaders, Jesus says, no, but I am the true vine. You see, soon Jesus' own disciples, they'll be asking themselves, how can we remain connected to God and accepted by him if the religious leaders have rejected us and removed us from the flock or severed us from the vine? You see, Jesus addressed that very question to the blind man who was telling others that Jesus had healed him, and the religious leaders came and excommunicated him from the community. Jesus now protects his disciples from that very same future question and accusation when he's saying here that I am the true vine. Let me explain it this way. In the first century Jewish mind, the vine or the vineyard of God, it carried a lot of imagery with it. I think their minds would have thought back to a few different things, the first being the Old Testament prophets. You see, in the Old Testament, a vineyard was used again and again as a picture of the nation of Israel. Your mind might go to Psalm chapter 80 when God is rebuking the shepherds of Israel through the pen of the psalmist for allowing the beautiful, fruitful vine that God had planted and was causing to grow. What they did is they allowed it to become corrupted and to be destroyed by others. Or maybe your mind goes to the prophet Jeremiah in the 2nd chapter, where in verse 21 he says, I had planted you like a choice vine of sound and reliable stock. How then did you turn against me into a corrupt wild vine? Or in Ezekiel 15, where he warns that the vine would soon be uprooted, removed, and burned by her enemies. But the most famous one is found in the writings of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 5. Most of our Bibles would caption it, God's disappointing vineyard, because of what God says addressing his vineyard and asking those who are observing the kind of care he gave to his vineyard to cast judgment on whether or not he had failed or the vineyard had failed. Because what it tells you in Isaiah chapter 5 is that God planted this vineyard on a fruitful hill, that he removed all the stones, preparing the grounds to plant the choicest of vines, and that he then built a tower in the middle of it in order to protect it, and he placed a wine press there too. And it says that God describes the vineyard as his beloved. You see, the vineyard, it's telling you, had everything that it needed to succeed and be fruitful. But then in verse 3, it makes this statement that it brought forth wild, useless grapes. The vineyard rebelled. And then a haunting question is asked, where God is asking, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. He's asking you to think, who is at fault? Who is in error? Who is to blame? He asks, what more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done for it? And then God reveals, he says, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. And in response to Israel's rebellion, that God had just said, look at all that I've done for you, and yet you're rebelling against me. In response to their rebellion, after doing everything that he could for them, God then warned them that he would allow judgment and destruction to come. So with that context in mind of the ancient prophet saying that Israel was the vineyard, Jesus comes and says, but I am the true vine. Again, our question is, what would come to mind for the disciples of Jesus who stood before him in that moment, in that first century context that these words were spoken into? At the very least, the Old Testament prophets would have come to mind, but I'm certain that events of that very week would have come to mind. Remember that this is Jesus' Passion Week. It's the final week of his life, and it began as he entered into the temple. Remember, he entered in on Palm Sunday. That very same week that Jesus would make this statement to his friends that I am the vine, Jesus had already told his enemies, or those who had made themselves or made Jesus their enemy, remember the religious leaders, he had told them a story about a vineyard after they came publicly challenging him. Remember, it's just days before this moment where Jesus is in the upper room with his friends that Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem to a king's welcome. But what he did next caused the crowds to disperse in their disappointment, because he didn't go and attack the Romans. He didn't show up in their fortress. Instead, where did you remember him going? He went instead to the temple. And it says that he observed all that was happening there, and then he left only to come back the next day determined to overthrow the tables and the system that the religious leaders had set up inside the house of God, the very dwelling place of God, and the connecting point between God and man. It's interesting, there's an ancient historian by the name of Josephus, who's a Jewish historian in the first century, and he tells us the very place in the temple that Jesus was standing when surrounded by these religious leaders who come to challenge Jesus, that it was in those courts that the inside of them were fashioned like a golden vineyard, where there was these ornate golden vines that were fashioned along the walls with clusters of grapes that were there in commemoration. It was a way for you to step into and remember to commemorate that God had called the nation of Israel his vineyard. And now you're stepping into the meeting place of God and man, the temple, and you're brought into that imagery. Historians tell us Herod the Great is the one who put it all together, that he had the gates forged in Greece and then shipped at great cost and great effort to Jerusalem, that the gates were made of bronze and that they were fashioned into them these massive clusters of grapes and golden vines. Josephus says it this way: the gate opening into the building of the temple was, as I say, completely overlaid with gold, as was the whole wall around it. It had, moreover, above it those golden vines from which depended grape clusters as tall as a man. Jesus walked into, think about this, God's vineyard, the temple, only to say that it rebelled and devolved into a den of thieves just days before pronouncing instead that I am the true vine. Creating a contrast here. Okay, think this through. The day after Jesus publicly cleansed the temple, the religious leaders went to Jesus with their demands like, hey, by what authority are you doing this? How dare you come in here and do this? Who do you think you are? You might remember that for all intents and purposes, Jesus had destroyed their marketplace when he overturned their tables. It was a clear challenge to their authority, and it was a blow to their pocketbooks as well. And rather than Jesus answering their question, he'll ask them some questions, and then Jesus tells them a story. And the parable that Jesus tells them, again, this is just days before Jesus stands before his friends and says, and I am the true vine. The parable he tells them is about the wicked vine dressers. And everyone who gathered knew that Jesus was making an accusation, that it was an indictment against the corrupt religious leaders, the ones to whom God had entrusted the care of his vineyard, the care of his people into their hands. Remember, the very same week that Jesus would tell his friends, I am the true vine, he would first tell his enemies a story about a vineyard. And so if you have a Bible still open, you can flip quickly to Mark chapter 12 because I want you to see the story that Jesus tells, because you'll notice immediately that Jesus' initial description in this parable is startlingly similar to Isaiah's description of God's rebellious vineyard. He starts with these unnecessary details regarding the hedges, the winepress, the tower, so that your mind goes back to that imagery of God saying, you rebelled, and so I'm going to allow this to go away in order for me to start something new. Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, says, then Jesus began to speak to them in parables, and he said this, a man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat and built a tower, and he leased it to vine dressers, or the keepers of the vineyard, and went into a far country. Now at vintage time, he sent a servant to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another servant. And at him they threw stones, wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully treated. I hope that your mind is going back to the ancient prophets. And again, he sent them another, and they killed him, and many others beating some and killing some. Therefore, still having one son, his beloved, he also sent him to them last, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine dressers said amongst themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read the scriptures that the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they, the religious leaders that he just told this parable to, sought to lay hands on Jesus, but feared the multitude, for they knew that Jesus had spoken the parable against them. So they left him and went away. The story tells you at the conclusion that they wanted to lay hands on Jesus. They didn't want to hug it out. They wanted to grab him and hurt him because they knew that this was an indictment against them, which is why they were so incensed by Jesus' statement. And remember, all of this is taking place because a vine owner who only loved and provided all that was needed for the care of his vineyard, now, when he could send nothing more or nothing better, no one better, sends his only son, and even he will be rejected by those who are entrusted with the care of God's vineyard. You see, what we're discussing is what Jesus says he is when he says, I am the true vine. You see, if in the Old Testament Israel is the vine, then to be found there, present amongst the people of God, amongst the nation of Israel, was to experience life and connection with God. Remember that you would pass through the door that was designed to depict the reality of that connection with God's vineyard as you entered in past the massive clusters of grapes that were fashioned onto the door that gave you access into the very presence of God, the temple precinct. It was quite the statement about the people's understanding that to be connected with the nation was to be connected with the life source that is God himself, and with the life and joy alone that could be found through that connection with him. So in their minds, connection to the people of God was understood to be your connection to God himself. But then Jesus arrives and says, but I am the true vine. And for him to say that is him to claim that their belonging would no longer be attached to a physical building, to the Jewish temple that would soon, within just a couple of decades, be destroyed. Their belonging would no longer be through their attachment to a people group or a religious establishment. That would not be how they would belong with God. They would belong simply because of their singular connection with a single person, Jesus is saying. He's saying with me, a connection with me. The prophet Isaiah would later write after writing about God's disappointing vineyard, he would later write in Isaiah 42 about the one who would come to do what Israel had long failed to do. What the vineyard failed to do, someone else would come full of life in order to do. He'd come to bring light to the Gentile world that Israel had failed to do. He would also be the one to establish justice throughout the world after Israel had failed to even establish justice amongst their own people. The vineyard owner is saying that the rebellious vine refused to produce the fruit he prepared and planted it to produce, but that the one that would come through that vine, Jesus, God in the flesh, Emmanuel, would arrive as a descendant and product of the vine, and he would alone choose to do what the vine had rebelled and refused and failed to do. You see, now Jesus is making it clear that connection with him, not with a nation, not with a political party, not with a religious organization, but uniquely a connection with him. Through that, you too can be a part of God's eternal work on the earth and be a recipient of life as he intended it to be, a life that is marked with purpose and the fruit of the vine, which is joy. Jesus says, I am the true vine. If I've lost you, come back and I'll just say it simply. He is saying, I am the embodiment of what God has long desired to do on the earth, to provide light to all the world, to the nations, and to reveal God with clarity to the world and make a way for man to connect back to God. Oh, look with me, not just at what Jesus says he is, he's the true vine, but you need to understand what Jesus says you are. Look at verse 5 in your Bible where he says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. And he who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit. So you will be my disciples. Think about this. If Jesus is the true vine, he says here that you are the branches. By calling you a branch, Jesus is making an observation and statement about all of us, about all of humanity. And it's that we are driven to find life and meaning and purpose and joy in connection with something outside of ourselves. We are a branch who have to find something to connect ourselves to, otherwise we wither away. Think about what he's saying. He's saying that like a branch that's disconnected from a life source, disconnected from a vine, we too shrivel and die without a life force that's found outside of ourselves. And I want you to know, I don't think he's wrong. I look at my own life, but I also look at society and culture and people around me, and they too seem driven to find a reason for existing outside of themselves. All of us seem driven to find something. But so many of us find that that drive is just an empty pursuit because we don't find something that gives us a reason for living. You can attach yourself to so many different vines, though. There's so many different things to try to attach yourself to, hoping that life and vitality will flow through it, hoping that joy will be its byproduct. Your vocation might be the source of your identity and the thing that you're hoping to extract a meaning for life from. But respectfully, how is that working out for any of us? Because haven't we met so many people over the years who've lost themselves and their families and their joy because their work became their identity and the place that they looked to as a source for life and joy, and it was catastrophic when they connected themselves to that vine, hoping that it would give them the life that they desired. I mean, it could be what drove you to move from another part of the country to come to a place like San Diego even. I mean, what a vine to attach to. The most mild climate in the continental U.S. It's a beautiful place where the sun is shining, the beaches are always beautiful, and yet you find very quickly that life source that you were hoping all of a sudden became like a crushing weight when for another year in a row we win the least affordable city in America. And the thing that you're hoping to give you life instead feels like it's sucking it right out of you. I know it's Mother's Day, but forgive me. It may be the reason why some of us even got married or had kids. It may even be the reason that you're eager to be an empty nester one day. When thankfully your kids jumped the nest because you found that vine you connected to, it sucked you dry. Physically, emotionally, financially, all of it. They took it all. Listen, if we're honest, we'll admit that all of us are looking to attach ourselves to a vine. We just want a life source outside of ourselves. We're looking for something to give us a reason for living, something that can give us a zest for life that produces some joy. It might even be what drove you to church in the first place. But what you found may be the startling and true reality that Jesus is saying here, and that is that religion itself cannot produce the life and joy that you longed for. Well, because if all that religion is for you is a presentation of another behave to belong formula, well, then it's going to crush you. It cannot give you the kind of life you desire. It cannot be the source of joy that you're chasing if it's only a religious system that you're looking for, even as you come here to this very place. Jesus himself is saying that it cannot be what gives your life purpose and joy. Joy and purpose in life will only be found in a relationship with the person who is Jesus, who's the true vine compared to every other false imposter that says, yeah, come and try this, and this will give you a reason for life. Listen, even for a church, don't come here thinking that you're going to hear principles or expectations laid on you like a heavy burden that if you behave, you could belong. Or for you to come here assuming that we're just here to throw stones at the world outside of here and talk about how terrible and broken the world is. Nor even to come here assuming that what you'll find is that we will talk about how broken we are and how there are great power principles to turn our lives around. No, we'll come here and admit how broken we are, and we'll admit our deep need for a person, not a system. A person, the vine, the true vine that we need to give life through our veins as the vine would spring forward and life through its branches. We need that kind of life force in us transforming our lives. My friends, we're here for Jesus. We can never forget that. We're not a morality club. We're not a political convention. We're not a social justice initiative. We're gathering because we're people who know that we desperately need Jesus, who believe what he's saying here, that he's the true vine, and because of that he's worthy of our worship, he's worthy of our thanks, and he's worthy of us asking him, well then we surrender to you, move in our lives, reshaping us as you desire and see fit. Oh, never let us forget that there is a singular true vine, and we are just a branch looking to find something to connect our lives into, hoping that it gives us a source of life and of joy and of power. You see, Jesus said, I am the true vine. He's saying that the life that you long for is found in me. And it really implies an even stronger statement, and that's that there's no real life found apart from him. And if wine and the fruit of the vine are symbols of joy, then he's even saying that there is no lasting joy you will ever find or fulfillment you will ever drink of apart from me. You see, we're considering this I am statement of Jesus where he says, I am the true vine. And it's important that you know who Jesus is, but also who Jesus says you are. You're someone that God has created and designed to need to find its place in something outside of yourself in order to really experience life. And we all know it to be true. It's just a question if we'll trust Jesus at his word that he alone can give us life. But the other thing that Jesus teaches us here is what the Father does. That's the third thing. Jesus also wanted you to be clear at what the Father sovereignly does in the process of all of this. Because you remember in your Bible, look again at chapter 15 in the book of John, verse 1, where he says, I'm the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, what does he say the Father does? He is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. Consider with me what Jesus says the Father does here. He's saying that God sovereignly works in the lives of those who are connected to Jesus, the branches that are connected to the vine, that he takes meticulous care for the vine so that it produces the most fruit possible. It says in verse 2, the first thing that he does, that branches that he finds that have no fruit, that he takes them away. But you might notice, maybe even in the translation on your lap this morning or on the phone in your hand, that there's different renderings of that little statement. In fact, there might even be an asterisk next to it with a different rendering, because it's a unique Greek word that's many Bible scholars and linguists are divided on what's being implied here. Some would say, because this word is commonly translated to raise up or to take up, some would just say that what it's speaking of is him finding a vine on the ground and grabbing it, taking it up and away, or finding a branch there, taking it up and away from the vine, removing it. But if you spent much time around a vineyard, and many different Bible scholars and linguists will agree with you, that what happens when the man who takes care or the woman who takes care of the vine, when they find a branch on the ground, is they often take it up in order to hang it onto a trellis in order to allow it to become fruitful again. You see, I think that this is actually what Jesus is saying here that the Father does. You see, to lift a branch up onto a trellis, it would increase its opportunity for growth as the branch can stretch out now unhindered. It reduces its capacity and opportunity for disease that otherwise would stifle its growth as it laid there amongst the weeds. And because it allows for greater exposure then to the sun unhindered, lifted up in the air, it would even produce the ripening of fruit. So what does the Father say that he does? Oh, the branches that have no fruit, he lifts up. I don't know that it's saying just that he takes them away. No, hear me today if you're burdened and if you believe that the lie that God is done with you and ready just to rip you from the vine and cast you aside because you feel that you've stumbled or failed. I think what it's saying here is that he lifts you up to give you another opportunity to produce fruit. The words of Jesus come to mind where he says, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. God did not come and demand, run from me if you're weary and heavy laden. No, he came and invited you, come to me if you're weary and overcome. But there's another thing that it says here he does. It's the end of verse 2, where it says, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. Now, I don't want to pretend that like agriculture is my thing, I don't want to lie to you and say I have a green thumb. I would be wrong, especially on Mother's Day, to compare myself to my wife and say compared to her I'd have a green thumb. Either way, I don't know that much about agriculture. However, I've come to learn a couple of things, especially because I've got some friends who this is their passion. And I'll tell you that my least favorite thing when it comes to keeping, because I tell my wife all the time, I wish she'd fire our gardener. He does a lousy job. But then she says, but I live with him and he's free. But my least favorite part of gardening is pruning. Our front yard, in January of every year, needs some serious pruning to be done. And I don't enjoy doing it because it's all rose bushes, and so you're scratched up and all of that, and that's not very fun. But the reason I really don't like it is because at the end of that pruning, dozens of rose bushes cut down. All that's left is brown little stumps and then red lava rock all throughout our front yard. It looks like Frodo's trek through the Shire and all the way to Mordor to dispose of the Ring of Power. Like, that's every time I walk out of my door, it's like this depressing, like, bleh. But I've learned that you have to prune roses back, that every year, if you want them to really produce and to flower and to grow and to do what they're intended to do, you have to prune, you have to cut them back. I've also learned, because the only other thing we've dabbled in is basically tomato plants, that there's these things called sucker branches. They're these branches that just shoot off of other branches, and they suck all the nutrients from them so that the plant becomes unable to put the nutrients where it needs to produce the fruit that we want. And so you have to clip these branches that are only there to suck the life and nutrients away from other places. And that if I was a good gardener, I'd know exactly what to do. Unfortunately, I don't. So I just start chopping away, and it usually doesn't pan out very well. But hear me, think about this. You have a good gardener. And he says here that he prunes. That every branch that he sees fruit on, he will come and he will prune. But please hear me, pruning is not punishment from God. And all your pain, please hear me, all the pain that you endure and feel in life is not the pinch of his pruning shears. If you've lost a loved one to a drunk driver, or a child to a miscarriage, or a parent to cancer, or a house because of an economic collapse, or a job because of an unfounded accusation, those are not all the pruning of the master vine dresser. Sometimes the pain that we simply face because we live in a broken world, surrounded by broken people, housed in a broken body. But the beauty is that God promises to work even the worst of those things together for good. He promises that he's able to bring beauty out of ashes. He's able to step in and do wonderful things even in devastating moments. I'm not insinuating that all of these things are always initiated by the hand of God, lifting the shears in order to cut things that you love out of your life. I'm not insinuating that. However, if God is attentive to the vine, which I believe that he is, then in order for my life to be fruitful and be used by God, he's going to have to remove things from my life that would inhibit production of fruit. And there will be times where he'll take things away that have become a massive distraction in my life or yours. There will be times that he will protect us from things, even things that we desire with all of our hearts, whether that's a relationship with a specific person, or a promotion in your workplace, or a specific job that you're after, or even the use of a certain amount of disposable income. There will be times where he will trim those things away to protect you from things that would be terrible for your heart. Oh, there are going to be things undoubtedly that the divine gardener will recognize about the vine that will inhibit it from producing fruit. And his job is to remove and to carefully cut those things away. And my job as the vine is to trust him enough to hang on to those things with a very, very loose grip, allowing him to cut away what he chooses. Okay, now think about this. The purpose of the vine becomes incredibly clear when you find that the vine is being pruned. It shows you, it demonstrates to you that the purpose of the vine is to produce fruit. My friends, God's grand purpose for your life is not just for you to be comfortable and consume. God's grand purpose for my life and yours is that we would be fruitful. It's about you giving life and nourishment and joy to others, which is so different than the culture that we find ourselves inundated with and surrounded by, where everything is about living for your own advancement, your own comfort, your own freedom of choice, You see, you and I, we've been shaped into the ultimate consumers, living with the goal of crafting everything around us to suit our preferences and to satiate our personal appetites. Well, the goal for most Americans is just to retire young enough to be able to enjoy every aspect of our lives, having complete autonomy and control over what we choose to do and where we choose to live and what we choose to eat and even who we choose to surround ourselves with. We are the ultimate consumers who are guilty of being incredibly self-focused. But Jesus is saying you exist to bear fruit. And that fruit is not for you, it's for somebody else. Oh, do you see the difference here? This is countercultural. Jesus is saying that ultimately what you are is a vine and that you will not find life unless it's connected. Your life is connected to me. And because it experiences life in me, you now know its true purpose. The purpose of your life is to be used by me to give life and joy and hope away to other people. Our job is not to be a consumer. You could say it's ultimately to be consumed by others like grapes on a vine. Jesus said it this way. He says, "Forever who desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward according to his works." What does Jesus say the Father does? He says that he comes and finds the branches that aren't fruitful and lifts them up. It's that he finds the ones that are fruitful and he begins to prune them, that they would bear more fruit. But verse 6, he also says that if he finds a branch that's not connected to the vine, that's not abiding in Jesus, that ultimately the Father's job as the master gardener is to cast out the branch that then becomes withered and to gather them up and throw them into the fire that they might be burned. Elsewhere in Scripture, Jesus uses similar imagery. He talks about a shepherd who has a flock full of sheep and goats. And he says at the end of the night, when they've collected them all into the pen, it is there the job of the master shepherd to separate the sheep and the goats so that the sheep remain in his flock and that the goats are sent off on their own. It's the same thing he communicates when he talks about the wheat and the tares. If you and I knew anything about wheat, we would already understand this, but most of us don't know much. But a tare is a weed that looks just like wheat. And there's no way to tell when it's in the field next to the wheat as it's growing. There's no way to tell which one is which. And there's a danger, Jesus says, to go and rip out what you think is a weed. You might be removing the good work that God is doing in the actual wheat that's worthy of harvest. But at harvest time, Jesus said, there is a master who will come at a final threshing day. And at harvest time, the wheat will bend under the weight of its grain, almost like bending in humility, whereas the tares stand straight up and are proud and easily recognizable as being false and not real. And on that great day of judgment or of threshing, it's the Father's job to remove what is false from those who are genuine. And think, the difference between false and genuine, even in this imagery here of the vine, is not about who had the biggest show or who seemed to do the most Christian. No, it's connection to the vine, the source. The source is what matters. You might be here and say, I'm brand new to this Christian faith, but if you're connected to the source, then you belong. And please hear me, maturity in the Christian life is not just about who knows the most. It's not even about who's given the most or who's done the most. Maturity in the Christian life is who is determined to stay connected to Jesus. That's what it is. Isn't that beautiful? That there's not a tiered system, that we work through levels. Maturity means I'm determined to stay close to Jesus because I found in him life that I could not find in any other vine or source. That's maturity in Jesus. And that could be you, brand new follower of Jesus or walking with him for decades. But if you're someone who's been here and you're just a conscientious observer, then it's time for you to connect into the vine lest he find you as a branch that's just present but disconnected. Oh, please see and hear the gracious God of heaven appealing to you that you would choose to connect to Jesus personally today. To not just be here kicking the tires and walking the car to see if you want to purchase it or not. No, choose Jesus today. Embrace him today. Okay, we've talked about what Jesus is saying here in this statement that I am the true vine. He's telling you who he is. He's clear about who we are. He tells us what the Father does, but here's how we end, and we're almost done. Jesus tells you what you must do. He tells us what we must do. And I think more important than what you may get paid for is that you are aware of what Jesus has saved you and made you for. And that's the production of fruit here. Or you could say it this way: my hope is that what gets you out of bed in the morning is not what you get paid for, but what Christ has saved you and made you for, which is to produce fruit where he plants you. You see, the byproduct of connection to the vine is fruitfulness. Now, please hear me say this. We are not saved by good works. However, we were rescued and saved and are being transformed for good works, for fruit, so that the world could taste and see that Jesus is good. Again, I'll say it. We are not saved by good works. However, please hear me. You were rescued, saved, and you're being transformed for good works so that the world can taste and see that Jesus is good, that there really is life in the vine. But here's the thing, maybe the most important thing I'll say all morning to you, and that's this. A branch can't produce fruit. You see, on your own, you will not see life change, or your heart reshaped, or your heart becoming marked by profound, newfound love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. You can't do that in and of yourself. In our backyard at our house on a hill, we have an apple tree there. And I've never heard a branch there groaning or straining to produce fruit on it. Because the production of fruit from the branch is only based on the health of the connection into the trunk of the tree. If it's connected, the natural byproduct is that fruit will show up. Listen, I've cut branches from that apple tree many times before, thinking I knew how to prune it. It didn't go great. But I cut the branch, I threw it in the green waste bin, and gave it a week until, the garbage man came to collect it. I've never once walked and opened the lid of the green bin on the day of collection and found inside that the branch had sprung up and out of the trash can and produced all of its fruit while it sat there after being severed from the trunk of the tree. Because a branch can't produce fruit. In fact, last Sunday I was thinking already about my message for today, and I love the rose bushes we have in our front yard, and so I cut off my favorite rose bush. It's the healthiest one, this beautiful branch that you can see all of these buds on it. Because I knew by today, a week later, it would all have fully flowered, and you could enjoy the aroma and the beauty of this healthy branch that was connected to our most healthy rose bush. But as soon as it was severed, it began to die. Because on its own, it will always fail to produce what it's promised. Please hear me. Jesus made it clear that you will always fail to produce even what you'd like to see or hope to see in your life. Without connection to him, he said, you can do nothing. A branch can't deliver on what it's promising because without being connected to the trunk, there's no life inside of it. You see, our job cannot be, as followers of Jesus, just to focus on production of fruit. Because Jesus says here, you can't do it. As one author put it, he said, the degree of your fruitfulness as a Christian will be directly proportionate to how close you stay to Christ, how much you feed on his word, and how much you and how intimate your relationship is to him. My friends, we cannot make the mistake of bypassing friendship and connection to Jesus in our desire to be useful to Jesus. The most important thing you'll hear me say today is that a branch can't bear fruit. You were designed to bear fruit, but you can't do it. The only thing you can do is choose to stay connected to Jesus. You see, it's beautiful that the work that God does in your life as a follower of Jesus is described in the New Testament as the fruit of God's Spirit. Think of that imagery. The things that God does in you, the love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, the self-control, are the byproduct of the Spirit's presence in you. Because you're connected to the vine, just as life was going from the vine into the branch, the life of the Spirit is now moving into your life, producing those things in you. You see, the only thing for the fruit of God's Spirit to be present in your life that you need is the Spirit of God present inside of you. But we can't be so foolish and arrogant to just focus on behavioral reform. We have to instead prioritize connection to Jesus and let him produce the fruit in our lives that he desires. It's really beautiful to me because it reminds me that we never graduate from our need for Jesus. We never graduate from our need for the gospel. We never graduate from our need to stay humbly determined to sit close to Jesus. Jesus tells you what you must do. He says, you must abide in me. Just that. It's a churchy word, I know, but it just means to remain or to tarry. To tarry means to rest in place, to linger in expectation. That's what my relationship with Jesus should be, that I linger with him, that I sit with him, that I rest with him. It's resting in my identity as the beloved of God. Abiding, it's not merely obeying. If that's all you think it is, either you or Jesus are mistaken. Abiding is resting in your identity with him. You know, if you haven't done so already, why don't you close your Bible? You know, this week in my own life, God really used this final statement to speak to me. And part of it was, for sure, for me, and I'll just admit this sincerely, for part of it for me, it was him getting my attention again to remind me that I have to have abiding with him, resting with him, sitting with him, being with him as my first priority. It's funny, I recently read something about the introduction of the word priority into the English language, that for over 500 years it existed in singular form because everyone understood the reality that you get one priority in life. And so a word was crafted in order to describe that. But about 100 years ago or so, when life became more complicated and complex, we changed that English word to now include a plural version of it, where now we can have priorities. But the change in language does not change reality. You get one priority in life. You get one vine that you're connected to. And for me this week, the Lord really convicted me that, Trevor, you're looking other directions and bypassing connection with me. But the second thing that this week this just spoke to me personally was just also my need to be reminded of the kind of love that he has for me. Remind me of why I'd sit with him and make connection to him my first priority in life. And I'll be honest with you and admit that one of the reasons I can go to other things as a source of life or to reach for other things that I want to heal my brokenness or hurt or insecurities and shortcomings is that I'm driven that way to reach for those things because I don't always see myself as very lovable. Because I feel determined to work hard to make myself more lovable. But this week, just meditating on this passage, I was hit with a gut punch of a reminder of the kind of love that Jesus has for me. In fact, for me with sermon prep, I try to start early in the week so that I can just marinate on what a passage is saying. And then, unfortunately, sometimes it's like, you know, when I'm on a run, I'm thinking about it. When I'm driving a car, I'm thinking about it. When I'm laying in bed wanting to sleep, I'm thinking about it. But this week, while on a drive on Friday, I found myself thinking about what Jesus says here about the kind of love that we receive from him, where he says, he compares it to the love that he receives from the Father. Just as the Father loves the Son, so I love you. And just in thinking about it, I just began to talk to the Lord and to talk to him about what that means, not just for us as a church, but for me as a person. And I just was hit with a beautiful embrace of the love of God. Like just a wonderful, one of those rare moments where it's like, wow, reality is reshaped by this moment. Where like driving a car, like, you know, tears flowing in this beautiful moment with Jesus and I. Because what an amazing thing. And a thing that I'm confident in, that the Father loves the Son perfectly. I'm absolutely confident in that. Because the Father's perfect and the Son is perfect. What's not to love? Like, it's great. And because the Father has everything he needs in himself to not need anything from the Son, he's fully sufficient. So he's not loving selfishly. He's not loving motivated by what he can get. He just loves the Son perfectly, completely. But to have confidence that that's also the kind of love that the Son gives to you. Jesus' comment here is to challenge you that if you can have confidence that that's the kind of love the Father gives to the Son, then you ought to have that kind of confidence that that's the kind of love that the Son can give to you. That's why he finishes with a statement about how there's no greater love than for one to give his life. Because he would prove that that's the kind of love that he has for you and for me. And so you and I, we can look at ourselves and say, Jesus, We are unlovely. We are unlovable in moments. And we can try real hard to make ourselves more lovely or lovable. Or we can just simply abide and receive the love that Jesus freely gives, a perfect love. And for me in my own life, it was such a beautiful reminder that that's what Jesus offers me, and that's why I'm determined to sit so close to him. That's why I'm determined to keep him my first priority. That's why I'm determined to rest in him, to abide in him, and then to see what God will do with my life. And so, Jesus, we thank you that there's not a heavy hand that comes down on us. There's a gentle hand that lifts us up. And there are two wonderful hands that would be outstretched for us on a cross. That you would demonstrate your own love for us, and that while we were sinners, you would die in an expression of perfect love for us. Jesus, we thank you that the one who invites us to be connected to him is someone who does give us perfect love. Someone who invites us to belong. Jesus, we thank you. And we're humbled just by the reminder that we find true life, Jesus, in you, and we find it nowhere else. So we thank you for this reminder, and we today just choose again today to set you as our new top priority. And Jesus, I pray for anyone who comes here each week and is yet to decide if you're the vine that their life is worth attaching to. Jesus, I pray in this moment that they would choose to embrace faith in you. And that they would simply say, Jesus, forgive me of my sin. Jesus, I place my trust in you, and I ask that you would give me new life and wash me clean and give me purpose and joy. In Jesus' name.